Fear within art. It's not unusual or particularly surprising to state that art has been used to induce fear, or that art has been used as an escape from fear, a form of freedom for individuals seeking asylum from the roughness of life around them. Art has been used for centuries to teach, to stir emotions, and to portray feelings from individuals. What I find particularly fascinating is the effect that art has on groups of people in times of explicit fear and worry. There's many immediate examples that come to mind when thinking about fear within art. World War I, World War II, wars between Western religions, propaganda, uncanny valley, and even the plague have arguably horrifying physical descriptions of the effects of the sickness. I intend to do sort of a sociological deep dive into some of these historic events, and how artistry shaped societal actions, or even how society shaped artistic action. Hello, my name is Hannah, and I'm super excited to get into this video today. Quick disclaimers before the video starts. I am not a doctor, I am not a historian, so anything that is said in this video should be taken with a grain of salt. This is for class, so it is based on factual research and historical events, but this is not actually proven by any sociologists. My words should not be used in citations or for academic purposes unless you have gone and looked at my sources and used their quotes or anything like that. So, yeah. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the video. The Black Plague, or the sweep of the plague through Europe in the 14th century, sort of marks the beginning of European history classes. In a funny, oddly terrifying way, it marks the beginning of Western culture, and shows the development of how societies move from underdeveloped into modern societies. While now many historians and researchers have actually proven that a lot of the assumed art from the 14th century that depicts the bubonic plague actually depicts leprosy. Leprosy was decreasing within Europe in the medieval period, yet there was still large amounts of art created about lepers during this time, especially throughout the church, because leprosy was seen as a curse of God, or, depending on the area in Europe at the time, from the gods. Art that depicts the Black Death is actually much more society-focused. Images aren't shown of individuals covered in red bumps and gross infections because it's not actually accurate to how the plague revealed itself. While they were still sick, and obviously looked very sick, they didn't look like lepers. This piece was drawn in 1349, and is one of the earliest known depictions of the Black Plague. The people in the drawing are depicted moving coffins, filled with individuals who have died from the Black Plague, into Tournai, a city in modern-day Belgium. The plague is a strong example of how society shaped art, how art was created through stress and fear, and the implications that art wasn't specifically negative, but it just sort of became negative based upon the historical situation going on at the time. This leads into the next point. If the bubonic plague is an example of how society shaped the art, or created the art based upon what was going on, what's an example of how art shaped society? Glass has been a long-lasting history within every society. The ancient Egyptians made precious beads, and the Romans developed glass-blowing techniques, while the English started putting stained glass in every monastery they could. In the Renaissance period, and in the medieval time frames before, many common people didn't know how to read, nor did they understand languages like Latin. It wasn't until later in the 1600s and 1700s when vernacular became popular within the church. Stained glass was used in grand churches to teach. Vast depictions of angels, Jesus in the heavens, or images of the Holy Spirit, things that peasants couldn't understand, were now physically illustrated in front of them, in a slightly overwhelming and definitely grand way. Stained glass shaped the formation of faith in Europe, before the Renaissance and Enlightenment period, and before the use of vernacular. While once the Renaissance continued, art became very key in most Europeans' lives, There was a large split between things like high Renaissance art and Northern Renaissance art, or Protestant ideals, humble beauty, and styles of the Baroque era. There was in fact lots of art, and churches were destroyed before the Enlightenment period. The Baroque art style developed out of Protestant fear and persecution from larger Catholic powers, and a lot of art was still destroyed all across Europe due to Protestant rejection. Stained glass is a really interesting example of how art began to shape the society. If it wasn't for stained glass, or the depictions of Jesus, or the depictions that the church wanted individuals to see, their faith formations wouldn't have developed. They didn't have vernacular, they didn't understand Latin, and they definitely couldn't read whatever the church put in front of them. Stained glass is an example of how the church not only taught, but they also seemingly took advantage of the feelings of different individuals. I mean, stained glass is grand when you look at it, right? It's sort of intimidating the way the light catches different colors and expels it. But it's also kind of awe-inspiring and mind-catching, I guess. In a way, they brought people in. They used the techniques that they had with them and brought people into the faith, helped them understand how they felt when they were one with God, or communion in God's Spirit. And that's even used in how the light reflects through stained glass. The whole landscape of the Western Front became surrealistic before the term surrealism was invented by the soldier post Guglielmo Apollinaire. Modest Extremes, Los Angeles Times, art forever changed by World War I. Turmoil and suffering are innately part of the human condition. Social suffering is the basic theory that suffering is part of the human condition and often found in social structures. It sort of plays into Karl Marx's idea of class struggle and the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. It focuses on how all aspects of society often frame individuals' lives and consistently create collective suffering. Zygmunt Bauman developed the idea of liquid modernity, which highlights the rapidly changing social structure and effects of society. The idea is opposite from the idea of solid modernity, which claims that relationships, social structures, and daily institutions are solid and predictable, and mostly unchanging. World War I is an example of both of the effects of collective suffering and the idea of liquid modernity. Got that right that time. Society was evolving during that era, faster than anyone had seen, and mostly due to the economic and materialistic threats from the war. Different countries needed to develop faster and better machines, better technology to reduce the amount of men that they lost in the line of battle. It's easy to forget just how fast society changed during the war. World War I started in 1914, and by 1915, flamethrowers were being openly used in the trenches. By 1916, the British were already introducing tanks onto the front lines, an attempt to gain land. World War I was completely new. There had been wars in Europe's history, like the 30 Years' War, but it was nothing as developed as World War I. It was shocking for the masses, and expression really changed as the war developed in Europe. Before moving on to the idea of expressionism, I really want to talk about this piece, Gassed, by John Singer Sargent. It is one of my favorite paintings, probably ever. Gassed was originally painted in 1919 by John Singer Sargent, and it looks like to be the remnants of a gas attack on a group of young soldiers. It's interesting the symbolism throughout this piece. Everyone has their eyes covered except for this medic. And even the boy at the front of the line, who's guiding all of the others, he has his eyes covered. There's people that look to be in pain or maybe shifting away. The whole entire painting shows just the uncertainty that was around during the war. There's this whole idea of the blind leading the blind. They're hanging on to each other and attempting to find normalcy in the horrors that they're experiencing. When you zoom in and look behind the boys, there seems to be a group playing football, which is a constant reminder that as much as these men had maybe more bravery, or maybe they were more virtuous, they were still young, and they were still boys, and they still experienced the whole war and all of those horrors through the eyes of a young man. They didn't know anything. So, data is known as kind of the beginning of surrealism and expressionism. It was art born out of fear and the roughness of World War I. It was made to break traditional ties, and in that challenge the narrative of tradition as a whole. Dada embraced spontaneous and irrational movements. It broke away from common artistic values and embraced odd proportions and even no proportions at all, using daily objects and collages to develop new and sort of weird artistic ideals. Hannah Hodge's Cut Through the Kitchen Knife, Dada Through the Beer Belly of the Weimar Republic, 1919, is an interesting example of what the Dada movement was attempting to accomplish through unnatural, untraditional, and exceptionally solitary designs. Dada provided sort of a basis for breaking traditional bonds. It began with a flood of movements focused on the anti-rational, and people felt really let down by tradition, or let down by the faith that they put in their governments to protect them. As individuals warmed up to the idea of being less rational within their art and within self-expression, and as artists began to be commissioned by museums and memorials after the war, there was an evident shift in the physical characteristics of popular art between the world wars. Paul Nash's The Menyon Road, painted in 1919, depicts a landscape of trench warfare. It's messy, imperfect, with gloomy colors and a lack of realistic perspective, yet it is really beautiful. It's dim, and it highlights the lack of life and the depth of loss during World War I. Die Mutter, or The Mothers, is a piece from a series of woodcuts by Kathe Kollwitz. She lost a son in the war, and her piece highlights the loss and shows the effects of terror and horror on civilians during the war. This piece is extremely complex. Soldiers in gas masks attempting to navigate their way through a war-torn landscape around them, while soldiers to the left are ready for battle. A self-portrait of Dix to the right, pulling a wounded soldier from the battlefield, that interestingly enough resembles traits similar to that of Hell. The unique rise of surrealism between World War I and World War II developed out of fear, out of a need to cope with internalized terror after the war. A rejection of the government and traditional views that had been engraved into everyone's mindset, the traditions that had let the people of Europe down. Now, I think that this is actually an interesting kind of side piece, that surrealism in the visual arts and surrealism through poetry and writing didn't actually begin to blend until a bit later. Poets and writers believed that surrealism was supposed to be specifically irrational and unplanned, and the tedious process of painting or drawing didn't exactly accentuate the values of irrationality and spontaneousness in surrealism, although they did hold artists in very high esteem. Surrealist poets were more focused on the belief of a free association, and valued people like Karl Marx in sociological opinion. And a lot of artists and writers actually ended up moving to Paris, and it became kind of a hub for the development of free expression after the war. And it's actually kind of interesting that Paris became really a hub for a lot of this expressionism, because we really see it blend into French painters in the future. And as Paris began to rebuild after World War I, it really did become a hub for self-expression and for art and music. That's why the Germans in World War II wanted Paris so bad. I mean, of course, strategically it was a big city, but Hitler did so much with the art of the time frame. World War II posed both a really interesting and inhumane threat to society, but also to the arts. It's no lie that Hitler had an extremely developed plan to steal art, but to also destroy it. And many surrealist or modern abstract pieces were labeled as degenerate. It was usually viewed as sick, immoral, and challenging the traditional norms that had kept both society and Germany strong for so long. Hitler wanted to align himself with traditional German values. He wanted to develop ideals of sociological solid modernity. Modernity! I cannot say that word. Modernity. He wanted an unchanging and largely structured society. There was a lot of communist and socialist influence within the modern and expressionism abstract Dada movements. Foundation was in the belief of sociological suffering, which obviously took from a lot of Karl Marx's actions and ideals. The Nazis stole plenty of art. They were thrown into small galleries in Munich, in cluttered corners, and to be viewed as less than art, to be viewed as corrupt. Once France and Belgium were mostly overrun, a lot of art was collected. And for fear of upsetting the Nazi regime, a lot of surrealism and modern artists kept their work on the down low. They weren't expressed as openly as they had been in the years prior to the war. Granted, there had been a lot of paintings from the beginning of the war, much like Picasso's Guernica, which was in the late 30s. The Nazi regime took from artists like Otto Dix, Vincent van Gogh, Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, Egon Schiele, Michelangelo, and Renoir, and obviously many other incredible and very notable artists. The Nazi regime plundered from Jewish families, burned and ruined Jewish art and ritual objects, and everything else that they deemed too degenerate. World War II was more of an example how fear confines art, whereas World War I shows the development of unique art styles through the use of fear. Initially, World War II caused a lot of grief for society. It took work and research and care to rebuild the artistic community after the war. Yet, the same use of self-expression we see from World War I was born out of World War II. It had just been different. Art protesting fear and war and violence was created to mark the moment as a dark piece of history, and not to let it fade into ever-changing time, but instead to educate, to make sure nothing as appalling would be allowed in history books again. So there seems to be two sort of societal actions that come out of times of really intense fear. Firstly, like the bubonic plague and World War I, we have so much turmoil and terror that is instilled upon a society of people that art begins to change. It begins to shift and arguably grow more interesting or more beautiful. It's sort of like a beautiful interplay about how people groups instill social change in order to reform things, in order to make them better. But in situations like World War II, art was seen as degenerate from the past, and unless it was specifically beautifully biblical or beautifully realistic, it was seen as corrupt. That kind of shows how society is always changing, and it reinforces the idea of liquid modernity, because society is changing, and it doesn't just stay the same, and that can be seen through art movements and through the actions of people, no matter what they do.